Have you ever, like, really wanted to fix a relationship, but the other person just flat out refused to go to therapy?
Oh, yeah. That is incredibly common.
Right. Or maybe the relationship is actually already over, and
Yeah.
you were just sitting in the wreckage wondering why you keep repeating the exact same patterns, no matter who you date or how hard you try to change.
It is, it's a profoundly lonely place to be. The dynamic is broken, you can completely see the crash coming, but you feel just powerless to change the trajectory.
Yeah,
Mostly because, well, the other half of the equation isn't in the room to help you steer.
exactly. So today's deep dive is for anyone who has ever felt that specific kind of gridlock. We are looking at a really comprehensive methodology called EFIT.
Right, which stands for Emotionally Focused Individual Therapy.
Yeah, EFIT. And this framework comes to us from Fiatro Sullivan, who goes by Figs. And his background is wild because he actually started out as a Merrill Lynch stockbroker.
Which is quite the pivot.
It really is. A massive career pivot led him to become a licensed therapist and ultimately the creator of the Empathi method. So our mission today is to decode how your nervous system acts as this hidden biological ledger for your relationships.
Yes.
And, more importantly, how you can essentially rewire it, even if you're sitting in a therapist's office completely alone.
Because the traditional consensus, has always been that relationship problems require both people to fix. Like, if the dynamic is broken, you obviously need couples therapy.
Right.
But this approach flips that entirely on its head. It shows that the most critical repair, like the actual foundation of how you connect with anyone, it starts solely within your own nervous system.
Okay, let's unpack this, because right out of the gate, Figs O'Sullivan really stresses that EFIT isn't just, some watered-down solo version of couples therapy.
Yeah, not at all.
It is a completely different clinical instrument being played by the same musician, essentially. And to understand why it works, we have to talk about why standard therapy often falls short when it comes to deep relational pain.
Yeah, we're talking about things like standard talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Right, where you might get a worksheet and try to, logically reframe your negative thoughts.
Exactly. And to be clear, there is immense value in those cognitive approaches for certain issues.
Sure.
But when your problem is fundamentally relational-like, when the intense anxiety or pain you carry fires up every single time you get close to someone or every time someone pulls away, that pain does not live in your logical thoughts.
Where does it live, then?
It lives in your body. It fires at the level of the nervous system long before your conscious brain even knows what's actually happening.
It's kind of like trying to fix a hardware problem with a software update.
Yes, that is a perfect way to put it.
You can, change your thoughts all you want. You can recite positive affirmations in the mirror every single morning, but the motherboard is still short-circuiting every time you try to connect to the Wi-Fi.
That is the exact mechanism at play here. And this really brings us to the foundational science behind all of this, which is attachment theory.
Right, built out largely by Dr. Sue Johnson in this clinical context.
Exactly. And the statistics on emotionally focused therapy, or EFT, which is the foundational soil that EFIT grows from, they are genuinely staggering.
Like, how staggering are we talking?
Well, when couples engage in EFT, 86% of them show significant improvement.
Wow, 86.
Yeah. And 73% of them maintain those gains 2 years later.
Okay, those are massive numbers for any kind of therapeutic intervention. But the mechanism behind why it works, that comes down to this concept of the first ledger, right?
Yes, the first ledger.
The idea that the human nervous system acts as a biological record keeper. Like, it logs every instance of safety, trauma, and abandonment long before a baby even has the language to form a narrative about what is happening.
Exactly. Think about a toddler who reaches out for comfort. If the primary caregiver is warm and reliably responsive, that child's nervous system writes a line of code into the ledger.
Like, people are safe.
Right. People are safe. I am worthy of love. If I reach out, someone will be there.
Makes sense.
But if that caregiver is inconsistent or emotionally absent or even frightening, the ledger records a very different biological truth about survival. It basically learns that reaching out is dangerous, or that being alone is the absolute only way to stay safe.
Okay, but if this ledger was written before I could even speak, before I had a conscious memory, how on earth is sitting in a room talking to a therapist going to change a biological survival reflex?
That is the big question.
Because that just doesn't add up to me. Just talking about my childhood doesn't stop my heart from racing when someone leaves me on read,
What's fascinating here is the ledger doesn't update just because you grew up, got a successful job, and learned to look like you have it all together.
Right.
And that is exactly why sitting in a room merely talking about it intellectually does not work. EFIT doesn't target your thoughts or your rehearsed stories about the past.
So what does it target?
It targets the actual felt experience in your body in real time. It goes after the very moment closeness feels dangerous or vulnerability feels like an actual physical threat to your life. Wow. And to change a biological ledger, the therapist's role has to shift fundamentally from being just a passive, objective listener.
Which means we can't just think our way out of this first ledger. We essentially have to feel our way out using another person's nervous system.
Yes. And it is a radical departure from how individual therapy is usually visualized.
How so?
Well, in standard couples EFT, the therapist is basically a choreographer. They facilitate this deeply emotional conversation between two partners. The healing happens between the couple.
Because they reach for each other in vulnerability.
Right, exactly. The relationship itself becomes the medicine.
But in EFIT, there is no partner in the room to reach for. You are just sitting there alone.
Right. So the therapist has to become both the choreographer and the dance partner. They have to step in as a, quote, temporary attachment figure.
A temporary attachment figure.
Yes, and this is co-regulation in its purest clinical form. Because your body cannot learn that closeness is safe merely by reading a book about it or, analyzing it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You have to actually experience closeness with another human being who isn't going to flinch or judge you or pull away when the really heavy, terrifying stuff comes up. You are literally borrowing safety from the therapist's attuned, regulated nervous system.
So the therapist is essentially acting as a nervous system donor for the duration of the session.
A nervous system donor, yes. I like that.
That is wild to think about. But it makes me wonder about boundaries. You know, how does a therapist manage to be this deeply emotionally attuned, literally letting you borrow their nervous system without crossing the line into becoming a parent substitute or just a really good friend?
Well, the professional boundary is actually what makes the co-regulation safe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the therapist isn't becoming your friend. They are engaging in a highly demanding clinical skill. They have to deeply track their own nervous system while simultaneously tracking yours.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. They have to know exactly when to lean in, when to back off, when to push the emotional system just a bit to keep you engaged, and when your system desperately needs a break.
So they're anchoring you.
Exactly. They act as a safe anchor without getting pulled out to sea with you. It requires such intense attunement that EFIT certification is an entirely separate credential from couples EFT.
That makes total sense. So if the therapist is stepping in as this temporary dance partner to help regulate your nervous system, what does that actually look like in the room?
Well, Figgs O'Sullivan lays out a clinical sequence called the EFT Tango, which just repeats throughout the therapy.
The EFT Tango. How does that flow?
So think about what actually happens in the room. The therapist doesn't start by analyzing your childhood trauma. They start by grounding you in the present moment. They just hold a mirror up to your physical body.
Step one, just mirroring the present process.
Right. They might notice you tensing up and say, your jaw just clenched and your voice dropped. What just shifted inside you right now?
Oh, wow. So instead of letting you stay in your head spinning a story, they force you to notice your physical body. What happens next?
Step 2 is affect assembly and deepening. Once you are grounded in that physical sensation, the therapist makes a highly educated felt guess about what emotion is hiding underneath that physical reaction.
Like what?
It's called an empathic conjecture. They might say, I wonder if underneath that sudden frustration, there's a really deep feeling of, I don't matter. Does that land for you?
I love that. So instead of analyzing you from a textbook and telling you how you feel, they are basically throwing out an emotional lifeline and seeing if your body grabs it.
Exactly. And if your body grabs it, like if you tear up or exhale deeply, you've found the core emotion. And this is where EFIT completely diverges from traditional talk therapy.
Because usually you try to fix that emotion.
Right. Instead of finding that vulnerable emotion and moving past it to solve the problem, you stay there. You slow down and turn up the volume on it.
Turning up the volume.
Yeah, this is step 3, heightening. You stay right on what clinicians call the therapeutic edge. It's the zone where your nervous system is activated enough to create a brand new emotional experience, but not so overwhelmed that you panic and just shut down.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because earlier we mentioned Figgs O'Sullivan's background as a Merrill Lynch stockbroker.
Yes, quite the stressful environment.
Exactly. He knows intimately what it is like to build an entire identity around performance, control, and, never letting anyone see what's actually going on underneath the suit.
Oh, absolutely.
So for someone like that, a high achiever who lives and dies by control, isn't turning up the volume on their deepest vulnerability going to feel like an absolute threat to their survival?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that perceived threat to survival is exactly why people develop defenses in the first place.
Right.
When a highly defended person gets close to that core wound of feeling unlovable or inadequate, their internal alarm bells just ring. Their nervous system deploys what we call protector parts.
Protector parts, like what do you...
Well, they will suddenly go numb, or they will start intellectualizing the emotion like it's a science experiment, or they will completely deflect with a sarcastic joke.
And usually a therapist would try to break that down, right?
Exactly. Most therapeutic approaches view this as resistance that needs to be broken down.
But this approach says you don't fight the armor.
Right. You honor it. This is step 4, working with protector parts. EFIT recognizes that this armor kept you alive when you were younger, so the therapist actually gets to know the protector part.
Really? How do they do that?
They might say, I see you're making a joke right now. What is that joke trying to save you from feeling?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It is the only way to get a highly defended, hypervigilant nervous system to eventually realize it is safe enough in this room to lower its shields.
So, my intense need to aggressively reorganize the entire garage every single time I feel emotionally vulnerable is actually just a protector part wearing a tool belt. Good to know.
It is. It's doing a very important job for you. And once you and the therapist can acknowledge that protector and ask it to step aside just for a moment, you move to step 5, which is integration.
Integration.
Yes, you can finally integrate the real emotion. You touch the raw nerve of the fear or the sadness. You feel it fully in your body. You realize you aren't alone because the therapist is right there with you. And crucially, you survive it.
And that creates a brand new data point in your nervous system.
Exactly.
So the old recordings of trauma or abandonment, they don't get erased, but they get basically outvoted by this new experience of safety. And that leads to this incredibly profound concept of time traveling.
Yes, time traveling. You are re-inhabiting the present moment, fully anchored by the safety of the regulated therapist sitting across from you, but you are traveling back emotionally to the original place of hurt.
To give yourself what you missed.
Right. You are giving your younger self the exact missing experience of receiving love or validation or protection that they never got when the ledger was first written.
That is heavy.
It is. You literally create a new file of a safety, place it right next to the old file of trauma in your biological ledger, and it fundamentally transforms the way your nervous system responds moving forward. The old wound doesn't vanish, but it stops running the show.
Amazing. So once you've learned to dance this tango with your therapist and you are finally accessing those younger vulnerable parts without panicking, there is another huge piece to this, right?
Yes, stage 1 of EFIT, which is de-escalation.
Right, because you have to map out the negative internal dance you've been doing on your own all these years. In couples therapy, they call it the waltz of pain. Like one person reaches, the other retreats, both end up hurting.
Exactly.
But when you are alone, that waltz is happening entirely inside your own head.
And to map out that internal chaos, EFIT uses something called the RAVE framework. That stands for reactivity, attachment sensitivity, vulnerability, and engagement.
Reactivity, attachment sensitivity, vulnerability, and engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a way to functionally understand the chain reaction of your own pain.
Wait, let's make this real. Let's say my partner casually criticizes how I loaded the dishwasher. How does the RAV framework explain what happens in my body?
Perfect example. So the attachment sensitivity is your core wound. Let's say your ledger recorded early on that you are a failure.
Okay.
When your partner criticizes the dishwasher, they accidentally poke that wound. That's the sensitivity. Then comes the vulnerability. That's the absolute terror underneath that. The fear that you are unlovable and they are going to leave you.
Which is terrifying.
Exactly. And because that terror is just too much to bear, you jump to reactivity. This is your protector part taking over. You might get really loud and defensive, or you might ice them out and walk away.
Right.
And that reactivity dictates your engagement with the world. That's the RVE framework.
And a huge part of understanding that reactivity involves Donald Nathanson's compass of shame, right?
Yes, the compass of shame.
Because shame isn't just, feeling embarrassed about a mistake. Biologically, it is a sudden, violent interruption of positive feeling that gets fused with an attachment wound.
Yeah.
It is the overwhelming core belief that I am not enough, or I am completely alone.
And human beings literally cannot tolerate sitting in that raw shame. So when it hits, our nervous system flees in one of 4 directions on this compass.
4 directions, what are they?
Well, you might flee to attack self, where you spiral into self-loathing.
Okay.
Or you might flee to attack other, where you turn around and scream at your partner about how they never do the laundry.
Classic deflection.
Right. You might withdraw entirely and just hide. Or the 4th direction, you might go to avoidance.
Oh, avoidance.
Yes, which is where we see things like doom scrolling for 6 hours, drinking, or, overworking yourself to exhaustion.
It is like wearing a heavy winter coat for so long that you forget it is clothing. You just start to think it is your actual skin.
That is exactly what happens.
If you live in the attack, other, or avoidance quadrant of that compass long enough, you start to believe that this defensive armor is simply your personality.
Yes, you think, oh, I'm just an angry person, or I'm just a workaholic.
Right. But I have to ask, once we map out this Ravi framework and figure out where we go on the compass of shame,
Yeah.
how do we stop ourselves from just using these frameworks to intellectually overanalyze our trauma without actually healing it?
Oh, that is such a good question.
Because I can easily see myself just making a neat little spreadsheet of my protector parts, categorizing my shame, and feeling like I've, quote, done the work without changing anything.
That is the ultimate trap for smart, high-achieving people. Intellectualizing the cane is just another protector part.
Wow, mind blown.
Yeah, and it is exactly why EFIT utilizes a practice called reflexive participation, which is the core of stage 2, restructuring.
Reflexive participation.
Right. This is the functional mechanism that keeps you out of your head and in your body. It is the practice of splitting your consciousness in a healthy way.
Splitting your consciousness. Explain how that actually works in practice.
Well, imagine one part of your brain is allowed to completely feel the raw terror of abandonment or the sting of shame in your chest. You don't suppress it.
Okay, you just feel it.
But at the exact same time, a newly developed, regulated part of your brain is sitting right next to it, holding a clipboard, basically witnessing the feeling without getting swept away by it.
Okay.
It says, wow, look how scared our younger self is right now.
Yeah.
We are really feeling that in our gut. But it's okay. We are safe.
So you shift away from the rehearsed story of other, what they did to me, why they are wrong, the narrative you've told 100 times at dinner parties.
Exactly.
And you move into the raw experience of self. You are meeting those younger parts, like the child who learned love is unreliable, the teen who decided needing people is weakness, not as abstract concepts on a spreadsheet, but as living, breathing sensations happening inside you right now.
And you are holding them with compassion rather than trying to fix them or shut them up.
All of this internal time traveling, the mapping, the nervous system regulation with a therapist, it is incredible work.
It really is.
But how does fixing the relationship with your younger self in a sterile clinical room actually prepare you for when a real, unpredictable, messy human partner enters the picture? They aren't going to perfectly regulate your nervous system the way a therapist does.
That is very true. The reality is that the absolute best place to do relational work is inside a real relationship because the emotional activation is happening live and unscripted.
Right.
Individual therapy can sometimes stay a bit theoretical if it isn't applied, but EFIT acts as the ultimate preparation. If you do this work individually, you walk into a relationship or into couples therapy already knowing your cycle.
Because you know your protector parts.
Exactly. You know your core attachment sensitivity. You aren't flying blind, reacting to your partner as if they are the enemy.
And if you happen to have a reluctant partner, which is, the scenario we started this whole conversation with, doing this individual work creates what is known as a pipeline.
Yes, the pipeline.
Instead of begging a terrified partner to commit to years of intense couples therapy, you completely change the ask. You just ask them to come to one single session where, as Figs points out, no one has ever died.
Which is a great way to pitch it.
Right. And if they do show up, one person in that dynamic is already de-escalated, vulnerable, and mapped out.
Which changes the entire energetic dynamic of the room instantly. When one person stops reacting with their heavy armor and starts communicating purely from their vulnerability, saying, I get really scared when you walk away, instead of, you never care about my feelings.
Ah, yeah, big difference.
Huge difference. The other person's nervous system naturally responds differently to that. We are biologically wired to co-regulate. When you soften, it invites them to soften.
Right.
And eventually, this leads to the ultimate goal of the therapy, which is stage 3, consolidation. This is where you learn to internalize a caring presence permanently. You master what Sue Johnson called the ideal developmental task.
Mm.
How to be a good enough other to yourself.
So what does this all mean? To me, it means it is incredibly empowering to realize that you do not need a partner's permission or even their physical presence to start shifting your entire relational system from the inside out.
Absolutely.
You can do the work. You can change the dynamic of how you connect with the world, even if you are standing completely alone right now.
This raises an important question for anyone listening. What are the unmet love needs driving your protector parts right now?
Ooh, that's a good question.
When you find yourself doom scrolling or picking a fight or just icing someone out, what is the core wound underneath that behavior? Because the profound truth of this framework is that the defensive armor we wear is utterly exhausting to carry around.
So exhausting.
But the most vulnerable, terrified parts of ourselves that we spend our whole lives hiding are actually the most deeply lovable parts of who we are.
We are biologically wired for connection. We are wired for co-regulation. Anxiety, depression, and those endlessly frustrating, repeating relationship patterns, they are not personal failures.
No, they aren't.
They aren't character flaws. They are often just brilliant survival strategies that were installed into your biological ledger before you even knew how to speak.
And the beauty of understanding the science is realizing that those ledgers can be updated.
Yeah.
The code can be rewritten.
Yeah.
You do not have to be run by the old terrified recordings forever.
You really don't. Which leaves us with this final thought to take with you. If our nervous system's first ledger records safety and danger before we can even form a sentence, how much of what you confidently call your personality or your quirks today is actually just an outdated childhood survival strategy, just waiting for a biological system update? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep reaching for connection.